Good morning, Rachel. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Really good, really good. Well, thank you so much for making the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. It's brilliant to get the chance to talk to you. And we have some sort of interesting overlaps with some of our guests because I've been lucky to interview Jasmine and Marianne from Our Hen House and Miko from Sentient Media, two organisations I know. I think you're on the board of both.
Yes. Yeah.
So I've heard your name many times before, so it's great to get the chance to talk to
you. Thank you.
And as we've spoken about briefly, I guess this series of conversations are about what I think of as the two deepest and most important philosophical questions: what's real and what should we believe? And just as critically, what matters morally and who gets to matter morally? And I have an obvious bias because I'm framing these conversations in the context of this idea or worldview of sentientism, which I summarize as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So that says, when it comes to thinking about what to believe, we should take a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason. And when it comes to morality, the answer is in, or the clue is in the name, really, that we should grant compassion or moral consideration to all sentient beings. But I'm talking in these conversations to people who agree and disagree with the philosophy. So it'll be, fascinating to understand your own journey and where you've got to now. And before we come on to those questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work for those who don't know you?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me. I'm excited to have more clarity over my own thoughts on all these big issues after talking them through for an hour. Like what a privilege to be able to just have the opportunity to do that. I'm a journalist. I started in radio, and then I worked for a website called The Daily Beast as a writer and editor. And then I went on to found a website called Bustle, which is leading women's website. And there I was senior features editor. And while I was there, I became vegan and started writing more about veganism in addition to all the other things I was writing about.
It tends to draw you in, doesn't it? Once you
Yes, you want to tell everyone, especially in the beginning. I think it's sort of that like honeymoon phase a little bit where you're just like feeling great and you think, if I could just tell everyone the truth, then they'll come and see too. And and then you kind of a few years later start to realize, oh no, that's not unfortunately totally how it works. But somewhat, I definitely know that I have helped some people come to veganism through writing. And then I ended up leaving Bustle to work for Mercy for Animals as their lead writer. And I was writing things they needed for the organization, ghost writing editorials, but also sort of working as a freelancer on the vegan beat. So writing a wide variety of articles related to all kinds of angles related to animal agriculture, veganism, approaching it as a health story, an environmental story, whatever else. And that was really cool because it's very hard to, make a living being a freelancer. Yeah. And I thought Mercy for Animals was really innovative in that they saw, it would be worth their time as part of sort of their ideas around education and public outreach to help fund some of that journalism so that people, when they Google questions like, what does humane meat actually mean? An article I wrote for Vox comes up and it's heavily researched and factual, and maybe quotes Mercy for Animals, an expert there. So it's kind of a new way of promoting organizations. But anyway, that's
And your pieces ended up getting published pretty much everywhere, as I understand it. So
a lot of different places, a wide array. So that was really cool. And then I very hesitantly left that job to start writing my book. Basically, before I even had a book deal, I realized for me, it wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to write the book proposal unless I had everything on the line, no income coming in otherwise, so that I really had to do it.
Yeah, committed.
Yeah.
No way.
So luckily that worked out. Yeah. I got very lucky that I got a book deal and was able to work on my book, which is now coming out January 25th. And it's called Open, an Uncensored Memoir of Love, Liberation, and Non-Monogamy. And it's the story of many things, but among them, during the time period I'm talking about, I come to veganism. And so, you see that journey. And part of what I'm trying to do in the book is have a nuanced depiction of a vegan who's very flawed, who's also, a sexual being, who's doing drugs. Like, I think there's this idea that it's a kind of aesthetic lifestyle. And certainly there can be, straight edge veganism, and that's great. But also, yeah, I was interested in kind of normalizing veganism through just having it be one facet of a much larger exploration and question of what does it mean to be liberated and for others to be liberated.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those themes as we work through these questions too. So the first of those two crazily broad and deep questions is what's real and what should we believe? So for many of my guests, it's a story about whether they grew up originally in a society and family that was more religious or supernatural, or one that was more agnostic, atheistic, naturalistic, if you like, and how that side of their thinking about what's real and what to believe has shifted over time, if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like. But yeah, it'd be fascinating to know your story.
Yeah, thank you. This is so fun to talk about. So I'm Jewish, and my parents both had more religious, strict upbringings with me and mixed feelings around it, where they felt very culturally Jewish, but, wanted to leave behind some of the stricter religious, ordinances, some of the gender inequalities that's built into more Orthodox Judaism. But it was very important to them that I was, culturally Jewish and had that identity. So I went to Jewish day school, and they were praying every day. And like the girls had to wear skirts or dresses on Friday, which was Shabbat. And even as like a first or second grader, I was not having it. I didn't like that. And I was kind of questioning it. And I said like, oh, I can't run around as well. Why do I have to wear a dress? I didn't like that. And I started kind of having psychosomatic, I don't know if I was faking sick or if I was sick, but I started just being like, I'm sick every day, going to the nurse and
finding ways to resist.
My parents got that I was not happy, and I transferred to another Jewish day school, but one that was more, I guess, liberal and not as religious, and was more about just like that cultural education around Judaism and some religious education, but very light and no praying and that sort of thing. So, and there I was very happy and was kind of instilled with the idea that, and this was the Bay Area in California, so really the most like, liberal activist iteration of Judaism, that it means about this concept called Tikkun olam of helping the world, that's sort of very built into Judaism, and that there's no real idea of an afterlife. It's like what you do on earth while you're alive is what matters. And so that was kind of built in giving back. And my dad is also an immigration lawyer, a nonprofit immigration lawyer, and for Catholic Charities, actually, was where he worked, even though he's Jewish. And, and so I grew up watching him, help a lot of people who really needed help, and felt proud of that and felt like that was sort of baked into my idea of what being Jewish meant. And then I think that wasn't super questioned until I went on a birthright trip when I was in college, which is, where the Israeli government, if you're Jewish, you can go on like a free 10-day trip around Israel. So I did that, but my friend had picked it, and she picked like the religious group by accident, the Chabad one. And I was just like very disillusioned by the whole experience because, they didn't talk about Palestinian people. They didn't really address the conflict at all, except to take us into some slightly more disputed territories to like show us why they were so important for Israel's security, but not really talking about. And I was just like, oh, wow, this is really not, I think that I had this idealization of what I thought, oh, Jews are like almost an exceptionalism that was very naive because of what I had been raised with, of like, we're the liberals and, like we've suffered a lot. And because of the Holocaust, like we care about other social minorities and discrimination and kind of like this idea of not like other white people,
Yeah.
And I think that on that trip, I was really faced with like, no, there's a lot of the oppressed becoming the oppressor here, and a lot of things that are not being talked about on this trip that I'm not okay with. So, I think that since then I've continued to be proud to be Jewish and identify culturally as such, but, question, I'm definitely pro Palestine and pro Palestinian rights, as well as thinking that Israel has a right to exist.
Yeah.
And I identify less and less with the religious aspects of being Jewish or any of those practices or holidays. The more I examine them, the more there's speciesism or sexism baked into it, as there is with many religions.
Yeah. That's a fascinating journey. And it sounds like the challenges and the stresses and the reasons you pushed back were, there were some ethical things, there were some constraints, there were some values, things in there that you weren't comfortable with that you've been challenging and pushing back on. On the sort of, I guess, the facts of the supernatural stuff, when you were young, even as you were challenging some of the things about, I don't want to wear this and I don't want to go there, did you believe that, there was a God and God had created the universe and the other facts that are told to you? And how much of that stuff, the strict facts of the matter about the supernatural, do you retain now? Because it's one of the interesting things. One of the things I find fascinating is even within every religious community of people, there are many more atheists and agnostics than you might think, and depending on what the nature of that community is, they can be more or less open about that. But one of the things I find fascinating about Jewish communities generally, certainly in the UK and the US, is they seem to have a very large proportion of people who are totally comfortable saying, yes, I'm an agnostic or an atheist, but I'm Jewish culturally, right, in terms of community and so on. But so I'm interested on the supernatural bit.
Yeah.
What's your journey been on that front?
So I was obviously instilled with this, relatively patriarchal traditional idea of God, of, it was referred with male pronouns and we were praying to him. And I think I was always skeptical of that, but I also always have had anxious OCD tendencies. And so I think that was like a place I could channel it. And when I was very young, unfortunately, my cousin, who was sort of the closest person I had to an older sister, because I'm an only child, I grew up seeing her every weekend. She was killed by a drunk driver, and she was only 12 and I was 9. And I think that the way I made sense of that, or tried to, was like, okay, there has to be some sort of balance. So Eva died because like her family is a lot wealthier than mine and like, has had everything really easy. And so maybe something had to be hard, but now something good's going to happen. And I would do this sort of like imaginary weighing in my mind. And it's sort of, for a few years, I had a lot of insomnia and I would kind of bargain with God before bed, in a very OCD way of like, I had to go through like my top, 4 or 5 people that I wanted to make sure wouldn't die. And like, if I didn't, pray for them to not die, I would be worried that they would die the next day. So like not a healthy idea of God. But I think that as I kept growing up and kept seeing like, oh, I forgot to do the prayers today and they didn't die. And also just, had more reason to say like, no, bad things happen for no reason. at all the time, and good things happen to people who are, not doing good things all the time, that I began to interrogate that idea of God. And I think, probably by the time I was in high school, had very little attachment to that idea of a God, certainly a male God. But, I think I've always been pretty agnostic and as skeptical of staunch atheism as I am of staunch religiosity, because how do you know? You don't know. And so I think my religion is much more one of humility, all that we don't understand and can't perceive and can't know. And I think the closest I feel to any sort of concept of God or something beyond, is a sense of interconnectedness. And I find it when I meditate a lot. I find it when I dance among the trees, which is sort of, that's my church or my synagogue, is if I hopefully can keep living somewhere rural enough in nature that I can dance in the woods or among trees, I've realized that's how I feel most connected to the world, or to something larger than myself.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, because in a way, my journey was a fairly classic path of coming from a quite anodyne, boring English version of Christianity that was never particularly heavy on our lives in any sense. And both because, facts and evidence and reason, and just learning about other religions and the history of my own religion, coming to the conclusion that this was something that was made up by men, rather than a reflection of reality. And then there was the other side of it, which you touched on already, which is finding themes of ethics or values that flowed through some interpretations of Christianity and other religions that just didn't sit well with me. There's the obvious homophobia, sexism, discrimination, anti-Semitism that you'll find in, some aspects of Christianity and other religions as well, and vice versa. But also some of the softer things that are much more widely accepted, but I still have a real problem with, telling young children that they're going to burn in hell for eternity if they don't follow the rules, which I think is an outrageously awful thing to do, but billions of people seem to think it's okay. So in a way, there were those two themes of, facts and evidence and reason, and then the ethics and the values. And where that's led me to is, in simple terms, I am sort of an atheist, but technically, you might describe me as an extreme agnostic, in that I remain open-minded to anything. That's part of this naturalistic commitment. I think you put it beautifully, right? We have to have humility. We're just evolved apes wandering the savannah, right? Why should we have some magical, perfect, privileged understanding of reality where our perceptions are partial, evidence is always conflicted? We have been wrong many times in the past. We will be in the future. So I like that humility. But at the same time, I am quite an extreme agnostic, because I think the probability, if you like, of there being a deity, is vanishingly small, because I've just literally seen no convincing evidence at all. So I put it almost at the level of, having read Lord of the Rings, I still don't believe that Saruman exists, right? So I don't want to be too trivial, but I think you're right. I like the idea of keeping that space open, that agnosticism, because as you've hinted at, or as you said, some people in atheist communities or naturalistic or rationalist communities can end up feeling and being, as dogmatic as the religious people they criticize. We have the evidence, we have the answer. I will truck no resistance or other perspectives, and that's a different form of dogma that can be just as damaging. So I like that emphasis on humility at the center. So,
yeah, and I think when it gets that dogmatic, it's then rationalism and science becomes just another kind of religion, really. And of course, yes, I believe in science and there's evidence, and I see how that's different than a religion, but it's, even many scientists do have religion, because they'll say they know how much we have no idea about. I mean, in terms of what we even know of how our own brain works is so little. And so, to say because I can't measure it yet, because it doesn't exist, that to me is another form of real human arrogance, because of course there's things we haven't scientifically figured out how to measure yet. That doesn't mean they don't exist. There's things that we might never perceive with our human senses that non-human animals already perceive. So I just think, that humility is an important aspect of even having a healthy skepticism.
Yeah, I totally agree. And while, and I think in a way that's what this naturalism is supposed to be. And part of the reason I use the term naturalism is because I think science is a really important, powerful toolkit, if you like, of a set of methods, but it's not the only way of getting evidence. I'm pretty confident this glass of water exists, and I haven't done a scientific test, right? So there are different types of evidence that can come through personal experiences and different perspectives, and I think you're right. Rather than having extreme confidence that things are or are not true, you can get to this sort of binary state. I think it's much better to have, one, be comfortable saying I don't know, and two, to try and, instead of having binary beliefs, set credences or probabilities and just say, look, I'm highly confident of this because the evidence is strong, but I still leave some space for doubt. Or, I have a very low confidence in this because the evidence seems very weak, but I'm open-minded. So I think we'd agree on that humility angle. And the paths people have taken that I've spoken to so far are interesting because some maintain a religious epistemology and value system. Some, like me, have sort of gone down that sort of more classic naturalistic path where I've sort of dropped any supernatural belief and basically say, look, unless there is evidence, I will choose not to have any credence in things until some form of evidence is there. And others have gone down a different route whereby they've either maintained a cultural identification with a religious community because of the community and the compassion and the coherence and the value that brings for the community. But I think they've often done two things. One, they've backed away from some of the supernatural epistemology, as I think you have done to some degree. And the other one is they've been very aware of areas where the ethics that come as part of the package can go awry, and they've backed away from those ethics as well. And in a way, even while remaining in a religious context and culture, they've sort of applied a more naturalistic ethic, which says, look, I like the compassion that we talk about. Let's make sure it isn't constrained or conditional, that we're not talking about in-groups and out-groups, as you touched on before, that we're not saying you can have compassion, but only if you comply, that we're not artificially constraining, we're not using the traditions or the rules or the supernatural stuff to justify causing harm. So I think, there's a sort of way of picking and choosing, the valuable parts that come through those different worldviews that ends up sometimes in a similar place. And I think what you talked about in terms of that connectedness and awe and wonder, again, people find lots of different ways to that. So some, again, find that through a religious worldview. Other people find it through a sense of being part of something greater. And for some people, that feels like a spiritual thing where there is some sort of something beyond the physical that has some supernatural essence. And I get it through just a very hard-edged naturalistic understanding of, reality and physics, right? So I like the Carl Sagan, we are all stardust, we are part of epicycles, and that connectedness I could feel, dancing in the woods is, viscerally important because of our evolutionary past and because of what I'm experiencing, and we are all connected. So I don't want to rabbit on for too long, but I think there's some interesting overlaps in the journeys of my guests there. So
no, definitely. I mean, I think psychedelics have also been important in terms of my spiritual and psychological evolution, and I guess tapping into that sense of interconnectedness and just all that we don't know, but also kind of trusting in that. And I think that's as close to any sort of religious experience as I've seen, but again, or experience of God. But when I say God, it's the same thing you're saying of we are all stardust. It's that interconnectedness, I guess, is what I mean. You could call it God, you can call it science, like it's both, So I think that, when the more I learn about interconnectedness and the science that supports it, just like how it's true on just like, I don't understand that well, but I've interviewed this one writer who wrote about it, Kurt Steger, and he was sort of trying to explain to me in lay terms, like the evidence for, interconnectedness and how it actually works, like on a just in terms of like what my body will become when I'm dead, and how it will go into not just the earth, but is like, and how I have stuff in me that's from many other, atoms and molecules. And like, I don't know. I'm not going to do a good job of explaining it right now, but I think when I hear that, I find it very comforting, because I think that one issue I'm definitely interested in pursuing more, like possibly even as my next book, is death and my fears around it, because I am not really convinced of any sort of, afterlife or any idea of a soul that will go on. I'm, I don't think I'm totally at peace with that at all. And I think that the idea that a lot of psychologists have termed like terror management as the idea that like underneath basically everything that we do, and every like social structure and organized community, is a sort of terror management of the fact that we have the ability to know we're going to die, and that this is finite, and our animal instinct to not want that to happen. And the tension between those things drives us to do all kinds of things, whether it be, fall in love, do drugs, organize religions, say our political party is superior to another, that it's always a feeling like, okay, if I can believe that I have more power, or if I can believe that my group will sort of like transcend my own life, that I'm a part of something larger, then I can sort of not think about the fact that I'm going to expire. And that I find that just a really interesting idea, and something that definitely resonates for me. And when I start applying that lens to things, it's like, oh, wow, fear of death is motivating all kinds of stuff at every moment, even if people aren't aware of it. I really do think that's what's underneath so much. So I'm very interested in, I guess for me, seeing if I can overcome that, or at least confront it in any sort of way through any means necessary. So I'm sort of envisioning something kind of like How to Change Your Mind, but where I try like the most, there's all kinds of interesting things around the world of like death retreats and meditations, and of course all the psychedelic journeys you can go on, and to just kind of try, like, by any means necessary, can I really confront this reality and make friends with it? And if I do, if I come to a sort of peace around the fact that I'm going to die, like what would that open up in terms of freedom for being alive? Because I won't be trying to manage my fear of it on some level at every moment, trying to be like, oh, look how interesting I am right now, so that I don't have to think about, like that I'm just gonna die and become dirt,
Well, I look forward to the book. I know, and hopefully you'll find that way to sort of reveling in the life you've got without it being tainted by a worry about the fact it will come to an end. But that would be a fascinating thing to journey through. And it's and you mentioned meditation. I'm not an expert in this at all, but there's one class of meditation which focuses, as I understand it, specifically on contemplating your own death and thinking about death as part of, an essential part of the practice. So it'd be fascinating to see how that journey plays out for you. And it seems to me like another one of many phenomena that comes from the really weird position that we have as a human species, because we are just another evolved animal, a type of ape, and we share so much in terms of experiences, motivations, drivers, context with the rest of the animal kingdom. And I think we underestimate how much even of our cognitive makeup is shared across species as well. But it does seem that, we've been gifted this sort of pretty remarkable cognitive kit up here, which enables us to do enormously positive and negative things to the world around us. And it has some really interesting psychological effects, not all of them good, like that one. I do think there's some interesting research been done recently that demonstrates, I think it's an article by Susanna Monzo, and who was actually done some interesting research into how non-human animals might actually experience and anticipate death, because that's a typical trope. People will say, look, animals are just, living from moment to moment. They have no fear or anticipation about their future lives. And I think that's radically oversimplified. But at the same time, I don't think there are many...
arrogant to think that we could know.
Yeah. But at the same time, I don't think there are many non-human animals who, are going through the journey that you're thinking of either in that same way. I mean, who knows? And I think that arrogance is another classic challenge, particularly around contemplating death, because our own experience is understandably so central to us because it is all we have, really. The external world comes through my own experience. So it is intellectually and emotionally just hard to imagine that experience not existing, right? So, but in the same ways we don't worry about what it was like, before we were born, maybe we can come to the point where we don't worry about what it's going to be like after death. And our Facebook
I would like
archived account would live on, as a memory.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I can have a certain peace with it not mattering, but I love being alive. I find it so interesting. I think that, a lot of my interest in being a journalist is like, just how can I try as many things as I can and talk to anyone I want to talk to and have these kinds of conversations, and I just feel like maybe if I'm lucky enough to live a long life and encounter, as everyone who lives a long life does, more loss, more illness, more death, maybe that will naturally bring about a sort of acceptance more than I feel it, now. And I'll sort of be like, okay, I can't do certain things I used to be able to do. Like I'm letting go. There's all these little losses that happen as we age or with every day really is a little death of something. But as it is right now, I'm still pretty much at the stage where I'm like, okay, but if I could have the choice to just sort of, live indefinitely as a 33-year-old and have my body working at least this well, I would love the option to just be able to call it when I want to, tap out when it gets too scary, and otherwise keep doing stuff.
Even if you struggle to come to terms with it, there's always avoidance strategies. So you can always, upload your mind to the cloud. You can push into the life extension technologies. You can have a go at cryogenics. So
right.
We'll see. But I look forward to the book. It's going to be fascinating.
Thanks. Yeah. And I mean, speaking to what you were saying before about denying our animal nature, I mean, I have this shirt, I am an animal, that I love to wear. And it's something that, you really can't say without offending a lot of people. But I feel like at least if I just claim it for myself, I can say it and make that point. But I just think a lot of human suffering also comes from really denying our own animal nature and needs. And that's not to say that we shouldn't question them or should use animal impulses as a justification for, all kinds of horrible actions, because that can definitely go that way too. But I just think, like, if we think there's just such a ridiculous dichotomy where we say like humans and animals as if those are different things. And that's why I like saying like human animals and non-human animals, of which there are many. It's not really a dichotomy. But yeah, I mean, I think with this first book, Open, part of it is an exploration of the suffering that can happen or just the difficulties that can happen with denying our animal nature in terms of sex and relationships, and that this idea that we are kind of a monogamous animal, or that we evolved that way, is really just one evolutionary theory that came about in the 1800s by white men's design that helped uphold like a patriarchal capitalist structure. It was informed by their biases. And there's certainly something to be said of like, that was a contract that was made as a compromise to ensure paternity. But it's like, when you look at, okay, why did you need to ensure paternity? And you go back further, that was really with like the advent of the agricultural revolution, where we had this new paradigm of like, I'll trade my daughter for your cow.
Yeah.
And so for me as a feminist, like with veganism, it's always been linked, right? Like these ideas came about at the same time of like woman as property and animals property.
Yeah.
And that a lot of the
Yeah.
evidence shows that before we were much more communal, much less concerned with paternity, probably much less monogamous. And yeah, this idea again that we're just exceptional, you know, less than 3% of animals even pair bond, let alone monogamously. And so like a lot of the times, even these animals that we say are the monogamous exceptions, like swans and penguins, they actually, what we mean is they're pair bonding for life, but they're not actually sexually monogamous either. And
really?
in terms of all of our all the primates, like there's over 300 species of primates, and all of the ones that also live in complex social groups like us, you know, with males and different hierarchical systems, none of them are monogamous.
Yeah.
So just this idea that we would be, for some reason, because of, you know, marriage being invented as a structure because of capitalism, is ridiculous. And that doesn't mean I think that you can't choose monogamy as a very good choice, but I think we see so much suffering all around us and failures of people trying to fit themselves within this system that is simply at odds with our animal nature. And so we're cheating, or so we're, you know, divorcing simply because we need to have some other experiences. And so, yeah, I hope part of what I'm hoping will continue to open up, that I hope to continue opening up with this book, is just the idea of like, can we have a conversation about this? And could there maybe be some more expansive possibilities for ways to be committed to partners? Because there's a lot in between total monogamy, you just are with this one person till you die, and the kind of most extreme polyamory where it's like there's no rules and we all have like 5 partners. I think it's again been presented often as like this very binary stark contrast, whereas there's all these options in between that I think a lot of couples would find a lot of joy potentially in exploring. So.
Yeah. Fascinating. And I think that links nicely into the second big question about morality and what matters. And as in many of these conversations, you can't really separate the two. We've talked about some of those themes a lot. And I don't subscribe to what's called the naturalistic fallacy, where people think that just because something happens in nature it is by definition good, because, you know, my simple view is that nature and evolution and physical reality is basically just amoral. You know, it just doesn't care about us or anything, really. It's just a process. So I don't think, you know, natural means good. But at the same time, if we're going to have any system of ethics, to me, that has to be grounded in reality, in a hopefully a roughly accurate understanding of reality. And that includes our evolutionary history. It includes the makeup of our minds. It includes different drivers. It includes context. It includes understanding other species. So that's partly why I really like this idea of linking a sort of naturalistic understanding of the world and then using that to ground ethics. And for many of my guests, that's been one of the tricky things, as they've moved away from maybe a more religious or supernatural worldview, because quite often what you get bundled up with that religious or supernatural worldview is, right, here's the list of rules, here's what's good. I would claim they're often arbitrary, deeply flawed, and sometimes downright evil. But you get a package, right? And when you move away from that, many people then have to think, well, what can I retain from that? Or what can I create outside of that is important to me? So as you've gone through that journey, you've already given us some pretty strong hints. But there's 2 questions here. One is, you know, what is your morality grounded in? What really matters to you? You know, how do you decide what good and bad are? And then the second question, which again you've hinted at your answer, is who counts, who matters morally, who warrants our moral consideration and our compassion, and how have you gone through that journey over time? So again, 2 crazily big questions.
Yeah, big questions, but I love it. I mean, I guess what matters to me is love and compassion and freedom. And so I'm of the belief that, yeah, my life is not more important than a cow's life or any other animal's life, and any other person's life. And I believe in the abolition of cages. I consider myself an abolitionist, not just for non-human animals, but human animals as well. I don't believe in the prison industrial complex. I think I would love to imagine a world where everyone's bodily autonomy is respected and no one's in a cage and they get to make their own choices. So, I mean, I guess they're in a cage if they're into that, but otherwise not.
If you want to be in a cage,
Consensual cages are fine. But, and then I think that's my ideal. And then there's the fact that comes up against reality and the fact that even though I'm vegan and trying to live a life of non-harm, every time I get in my car, I'm crushing hundreds of bugs. And I think that the more I become attuned to interconnectedness and to non-harm, the more I struggle with that of like, okay, I love to dance outside in nature, but I'm crushing all these bugs beneath my feet. And if I'm really not speciesist, shouldn't that mean that I'm very concerned that I do that? And so I've often talked with monk Tashi Nima about this. He's sort of my mentor, and he's a vegan Buddhist monk who leads animal rights activists retreats. And that's sort of where I came to meditation and to a lot of Buddhist thoughts was through him. And, I asked him, like, as a vegan, like, what do I do about the bugs? And he sort of gives an answer of like, you need to measure the costs and benefits and like try to reduce harm wherever possible. So maybe if you have a choice to walk on a cement path versus a dirt path, like walk on the cement path if there's less bugs, but also like you're going to drive yourself crazy if you're living and worrying about that all the time. That's basically like James, where they, walk around with a stick and like take it to a very extreme level. And to him, that's like not the path to go because you're creating a lot of suffering for yourself and you're kind of reducing your efficacy of fighting for the liberation of all beings. So I guess his answer is kind of like, if dancing in the woods really sustains my well-being so that I can be an ambassador for, all the animals, of which there are so many more in factory farms, like that I should sort of do that effective altruist measurement and keep doing that. But again, I'm not even sure how I feel about that all the time, because it seems like, okay, that's a very convenient answer for me, right?
Yeah.
But if I really, I think I have to examine the ways in which I'm still speciesist in terms of when I crush bugs beneath my feet, I don't consider it as awful on some level as if I were to be accidentally slaughtering pigs or hitting a human with a car, right? So even though I'm saying end speciesism or end harm, I'm still perpetuating these things. And I think that's some of just what you have to examine and sit with and see how you can continue to do better. The same way of, to be anti-racist, you need to examine the ways in which just by existing as a white person in our culture and benefiting off those privileges, you are racist. Like even, like you have participated in racism. And to be anti-racist, you have to examine the ways in which like that is true and what ways are you still contributing so that you can undo it. So
and I think it's a difficult thing to do, but ultimately I do think it's healthy just to recognize that there isn't such a thing as perfection. So some people have this sense that, once you've gone vegan and you've changed your diet and the products you buy, that's an end point and you're now some sort of ethically pure genius, right? That's just bullshit. It's just practically not possible to live without causing harm to others. And while that might feel frustrating and difficult, that just is reality, right? So we better get used to it and try and work our way through that. And that journey and that thinking will never end. And in a way, it's similar to sort of humility we talked about before on epistemology, in the same way as, you shouldn't really ever be 100% confident that something's right because new evidence might come in. There isn't really a state of perfection in ethics or our decisions or our choices either. And we just better get used to sort of, one of my previous guests, I can't remember the academic was quoting, was talking about, sort of sitting with the trouble. And, on the one hand, you could say, well, I can't be perfect, so I'm going to give up even trying. Well, that's crazy, right? Although some people do that, right?
Right. Nihilism.
You're not going to save all the animals, so why bother saving any? Or on the other hand, you could just let it sort of suck you down into a morass of despair, right? And I think that's part of the human condition, is finding that middle ground where we can recognize that perfection isn't possible, but we can still, find a way through and do what we can. I get the impression that you're thinking, once you went vegan, like, as you said, you go through different stages and you've matured as well. How did you get to that critical point of extending your compassion and moral consideration beyond the human species? How early did that happen for you? And was that a difficult or an easy journey to go through?
It was,
because it took me ages. So
yeah, it was a relief once I did, because it was, a cognitive dissonance that I'd been feeling since I was a kid. I was never super comfortable eating animals, like always needed it to be in kind of like I couldn't see any blood, or it needed to be like or tendons, like I was squeamish around it. But I was also...
And was that what it was? Was it squeamishness, or was there something else in there about...
Yeah, empathy, but it was framed as, by family or by culture as squeamishness or finickiness. And so...
But it was actually an identification with the being. Yeah,
which I think most kids have, and then just taught out of. And so, then I, when I met who I call Adam in the book on our first date, he asked me like, oh, it said on your profile, you're mostly vegetarian. What does that mean? And I said, well, I don't eat much meat, and I just kind of have a little bit of tuna sometimes or whatever. And he was like, okay, but do you think you have like a moral right to consume another life for your pleasure when you don't have to? And he just sort of asked it very straight up, not really judgmental, but like kind of like, do you believe in banning assault weapons? Like just sort of an ethical first date question, I guess. And I said, well, no, I guess I don't believe I have a right now when you put it like that. And, he was vegetarian. And after that day, had no one ask me that question directly before, even though I'd known vegetarians, my whole life. People ask vegetarians all the time, like, why don't you eat animals? But no one asks, meat eaters, like, why do you? And so, I stopped eating meat after that date, and we fell in love very quickly. And he was a great cook, so I just sort of started eating all his cooking, and that was easy. But then about 6 months in, we saw Earthlings, and he had been showing it in some of his classes, actually, but he had not become vegan yet. And I turned to him afterwards. I said, oh, we need to be vegan, or at least I do. And he was like, yeah, you're right. So then that's how I became vegan. Yeah, that was that in 2015. And I felt such a weight lifted, at least initially. Like it just felt so good to be living more in line with my values, not in a way that was perfect, obviously, but it was just a huge...
It's quite freeing, isn't it? You can just feel that cognitive dissonance lift off.
Yeah. Yes. And also my empathy just grew a lot. I didn't really consider myself an animal person before going vegan. And that was part of like why I didn't consider vegetarianism, because I kind of was like, oh, that's for people who feel a really strong connection to animals. And once I stopped eating them, I realized, wow, a lot of the reason I haven't felt a strong empathy or connection is because I've been preventing it, because I had to do that to be able to participate in this speciesism.
Yeah.
And so once that
had to be part of the story you were telling yourself to justify what you were doing. Yeah.
Yeah. I just felt way more connection to animals I would pass on the street, to any animals I met. And obviously a lot of that can be very difficult sometimes as you confront a lot of the suffering that's happening. But in general, I just felt like, wow, this is so amazing to go through the world feeling more connected and more equal, less superior, to kind of be dismantling this hierarchy was a huge relief, because I think it's closer to the truth of our interconnectedness and equality. So for me, it was just, yeah, a huge relief to not believe this false hierarchy anymore that has humans at the top.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, every species that exists today has been evolving for just as long as we have. So,
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. And in a way that, there's some slight differences in definition between veganism and sentientism, if you like. But I consider myself both, right? My sentientism, in a way, is the philosophical reason why I'm vegan. Vegan uses the term animal generally, which I think is a great shortcut. Whereas sentientism is focused on the capacity for sentience, i.e., anything that can suffer. And what that does mean is that it does leave the door open that there might be some of the simplest animals that may or may not actually be sentient. So whether it helps you too much with the bugs in the forest floor, it depends on the nature of the bug, because, as the latest scientific research is very strong that all invertebrates are sentient. And it's also pretty strong that some of the invertebrates are sentient, cephalopods, decapods, and good evidence for quite a few of the more advanced insects. I think when you get to the really simple insects, there is a question mark just based on their anatomy and their neuronal structure and behaviors, where if you don't, maybe you can't say, look, they're not sentient, but your credence in their sentience might come down a bit, and there might be something to say, look, maybe they have a lesser degree of sentience. Maybe the experiences they have are less powerful, less rich, and so maybe there is some sort of sliding scale. Although different sentientists disagree on that. Some are more egalitarian and say, look, if it's sentient, it counts the same. And others are more, and I'm in this camp, are more, look, it probably has enormous variety and lots of different flavors and qualities. And we should be very careful about judging those, because on the one hand, you might say, look, this simpler animal biologically therefore has a lesser degree of sentience, but they may actually experience suffering in a more visceral way, because sometimes our more advanced cognition helps us mitigate suffering. We might understand why this bad thing is happening to us, or we might be doing it deliberately because of what we're trying to achieve, or we can meditate, or we can medicate to mitigate, and some of these things might not be available. So there's just an enormous variety of ways of thinking, but almost regardless of how we work out which entities are sentient, it seems almost centrally self-evident to me that if our morality is about a concern for others, then those others have to include anything that has a perspective and that can suffer or flourish. So that's why I quite like using that characteristic, but it maps onto the animal kingdom pretty well. But there are some people who, in fact, the first time the word sentientism was used, one of the first times, was to criticize it and say, look, this is just another form of discrimination, because you're discriminating against things that aren't sentient. So you might think about, anthropocentrism is centered on humans. Sentientism expands to include all beings that have the capacity to suffer. But some people go further than that. They go to biocentrism, where they say all living things. So, for example, plants, which most people think aren't sentient, they should still count morally. And others will go, often driven by, powerfully and rightly by the environmental movement, they'll think about ecosystems to ecocentrism as well. So some people think that, I think you and I would both disagree with this anthropocentric view, because, what possible rationale is there for ignoring the suffering of non-humans? Just doesn't make sense to me at all. Seems like just as arbitrary a boundary to draw as drawing it based on race or sex or something, some other characteristic. But what's your sense about going beyond sentience to thinking intrinsically about plants or ecosystems or those things too?
Yeah. I think, again, like the more I learn, the more humility and agnosticism I feel around plants. I think that, that's one of the most common things you learn to have the argument against when you go vegan of what about plants?
Yeah, vegan on Twitter, yeah.
Right, and it's kind of like easy to get annoyed and to say, well, they're not sentient, they're not experiencing pain.
But I love that they have so much compassion. They even care about plants that can't experience. So imagine how much compassion they must have for farmed animals.
Right. And I mean, I think that the thing is, the more I learn about trees and like some of these books that have come out recently of what was it, The Secret Life of Trees or something. And the movie like Fantastic Fungi was really an excellent documentary. I mean, trees and fungi specifically, I mean, you look at their root systems and it's like and functioning in remarkably parallel ways to neural networks. And one of the people in the documentary was arguing, well, like if you think intelligence is like the capacity to make decisions, then trees and fungi have that. Like there's, you know, so I think that I mean, like I said, my religion is trees. So I think I do tend to anthropomorphize them in that I do think there's something, I don't know, I just feel a real connection with that. I think there's a real intelligence. I think the science around how they communicate and can work as a community and support each other and make decisions around things is amazing. And it's of course not like cognitive in the same way as us, but I also think, again, there's so many potential planes of ways to experience the sensory and consciousness that we just have no like ability to even conceptualize. And so I think I have to leave open the idea that plants are existing on these other planes and that there is a chance that every time I feel really good about myself for, you know, eating a salad, that I'm still creating. I mean, first of all, there's the harm of the environmental footprint of if I didn't grow the salad and whatever bugs were killed. And, you know, it's not without needing to take a moment of humility to remember that. But also, like, I don't really know. I'm just going with, okay, I want to survive. I don't want to go on hunger strike. And so I'm going with basically the most obvious suffering that I can recognize with my human senses. And the suffering that's having the greatest impact on our ecosystem. So I'm not eating animals and their secretions, but I don't know that a tomato wants to be eaten, you know, and certainly there's different things with evolutionarily that suggest certain fruits and vegetables do seem like they want to be eaten in terms of how they
that's how they procreate.
And other ones have, you know, these things of poison around them that suggest they really don't. So, I mean, I don't know. And I just kind of take that attitude of like, I don't know. I need to respect it. I need to try to remember that when I sit down to eat, to still feel not guilty, but like grateful to these plants. Like to feel a sense of respect for them, keeping me alive. And also to try to keep moving in a direction of consuming them more ethically, growing more of them, you know, trying to reduce my environmental footprint a little bit more than I am. You know, I've taken certain steps with that, growing certain food, but I still am guilty of like eating berries that come from, you know, Peru or something because I really like them and you can't get them here. And like ethically, I don't know that you can really justify that. So I definitely view it as a work in progress that I'm not perfect at. But
and I like the way it comes back to that same humility. It's a theme running through everything we've talked about. And I guess my personal stance is one, I guess I'm quite classical on, you know, where I think sentience is. And it's roughly in line with scientific consensus, as I described before, in terms of, you know, invertebrates and vertebrates and how that fits in the animal kingdom. I'm completely with you on intelligence within, you know, plants and fungi systems, and the more we understand about the behavior and their ability to communicate is mind-blowing. So I do remain open-minded, but my understanding of just the physics of their anatomy is that they don't have the capacity for the sort of information processing that has any analogy to what we understand as conscious. So I'm still, you know, I'm open-minded, but I'm still highly confident that, you know, a carrot experiences nothing as I slice it. You know, who knows? But I'm pretty confident on that ground.
I mean, I think that it's nothing like what our concept of consciousness is. But again, like, I just think it's totally possible that, of course, like if we don't even understand our own brains.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah.
Like, how can we claim to understand what consciousness might look like for all these other beings, plants. We really can't know.
Yeah. And I think oddly, I mean, I had a fascinating conversation with a philosopher called Luke Roelofs, who counts himself as a sentientist. He's a vegan. He prioritizes, animal suffering in the same way as you and I do. But actually, he's also a panpsychist. So his philosophy is that ultimately, in some sense, everything has some basic form of consciousness. And it's not a position I subscribe to, because I think that I can see a story for how, in the Precambrian, simple animals evolved the ability to model themselves and others and the environment, and to sense a valence that took them towards good things and away from bad things. So I can sort of see that story about how within the animal kingdom, sentience and consciousness arose. But because I have a very materialistic, sort of naturalistic understanding of sentience, that means that my personal view, and other sentientists disagree with this, is that what sentience is, it really just is the information processing. So what we feel is this wondrous experience is just what it feels like to run that, neuronal firing in our brains, and that's it. And in a way, the panpsychist, or more expansive view, takes that view and says, well, why is it just some types of information processing? Couldn't it be all information processing? Couldn't it be the information processing? Could the information processing that's happening in the fungal network feel like something? Or couldn't, the information processing that's happening in the electron buzzing around the atom, could that be like something to be that in some sense? But what, and I find that an interesting way of thinking. I don't agree with it, but I find it interesting. But where Luke took that really brings him back to, I think, where you and I are, which is whether you think that ultimately everything is conscious or not, or you think there's a possibility of plant consciousness and sentience or not, you can still grade the nature of those experiences in a way that essentially brings you back to where you, me, and him are, which is, in living our lives, we're going to prioritize trying to reduce the harm we cause to the entities that are most obviously sentient. And that's why we would eat a carrot and not a pig, in a simple sense. So it's a sort of long tangent, but I find it interesting how people come to the
totally. That's interesting. I'll have to, you said panpsychism?
Panpsychism.
Okay, I'll have to look that up. Yeah, I mean, I think that, but it's again that humility of like, I think that in so doing, I'm not outside of some sort of hierarchical thinking or categorizing, right? So
yeah,
I'm kind of not living up to even the norm I aspire to, in some ways, of like where all these hierarchies have dissolved, or that I think I aspire to, like, who knows, in reality that, with all my privileges, I might find that world very scary in all likelihood. So there's that tension between like what I like to believe and idealistically in terms of a utopia, and then there's like what I'm actually practicing and the choices I'm actually making, which is to really prioritize staying alive over the possibility that plants have a consciousness, and or even not survive, but like I'm about to publish a book and books are made of trees, like I have a lot of trouble with that. I'm just like, what am I, what kind of moral calculation is going on there? And I don't know. I guess I'm kind of telling myself that it'll afford me the opportunity to have more of these kinds of conversations with people with larger platforms who might, not otherwise be talking even about animals. And so like, I have to like, destroy some trees to be someone who's invited to speak about these things at all. But
I think it's a good
even
trade.
that is
it's a good trade.
Yeah, it's, we'll see. We'll see. It's the choice I'm making.
And you talked about this wanting to sort of drive to just, basically destroy hierarchies and remove those distinctions. And that feels to me like a progressive, positive thing to try and do. But I do think there's some traps there, and I don't think you necessarily fall into them, but with some of the people who go really far beyond sentience, and they say, look, again, often because of environmental concerns and climate change, this is in the zeitgeist now, but they will actually jump from a sort of anthropocentric view, which says, humans matter and hopefully all humans matter, to what seems like a really generous moral concern for the entire ecosystem, Gaia, rocks, rivers, systems and so on. And in that sense, they are trying to sort of destroy hierarchies and say, look, everything, absolutely everything matters. The glass on my desk, the rock, the tree outside, the pig, everything matters. And the danger I see in that is that if everything matters, in a sense, almost nothing matters. And that seems to have flowed through in, I've had conversations with a couple of people on this podcast where the tone is everything is connected, everything is one. There are no hierarchies, there are no categories. We are just entities existing in rich networks and powerful systems that have their own meaning and their own value. And as part of those systems and ecosystems, there is a circle of life, and life consumes life. And as part of playing our human part in that process, we must also consume life. So yes, I'll have a bacon butty and a milkshake, please. So, and I'm like, hold on, what? You've gone from something that sounds so super generous and expansive that everything matters, but you've conveniently carved out some really obvious classes of suffering and just said, suffering things don't matter any more than a rock or a river or a tree. And there's a danger there. And to my mind, and one of my previous guests said, look, a lot of environmentalism and that sort of ecocentrism is really just a disguise or a veneer over what is ultimately an anthropocentric view, right? So again, it's, I care generously about the environment because I need a nice place to live and because I enjoy the aesthetics of looking at pretty forests, woods and so on. But I don't really have a moral compassion or concern for any of the sentient beings that might get in the way of that, or that I might want to use in a different way. So in a sense, I guess part of the idea behind sentientism is saying, look, go beyond sentience, if you like, go beyond suffering things, if you like, but please recognize that the capacity to suffer really does matter. And I'd argue, matters more than things that are less likely to be able to suffer. So I think that's the key for me is, I find go beyond if you want, but you have to definitely include all sentient beings in your moral consideration as you go on that journey. And most environmentalists certainly don't do that. I find it deeply frustrating.
Yeah, definitely. If you believe in interconnectedness, though, then everything can matter.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't take you to a place of nothing matters, then everything just matters, period. And of course, I think for me, more the danger, just as a very empathic kind of maybe OCD tendency person, is like, oh no, now I'm going to worry about everything, right? I'm going to worry about, and it gets maybe paralyzing in that way.
Yeah.
But I would rather, take that view of everything matters, but that also includes me. So I'm going to try to reduce harm, basically. Yeah. It's a harm reduction. I'm going to have humility that I'm going to cause harm no matter what I do. I'm not, just because I'm vegan, I'm not exempt from causing harm. And there's a lot that I don't understand or know, and potentially a lot of ways I'm causing harm all the time that I'm not aware of.
Yeah.
But I'm going to do what I can, and this is one of the main ways I can kind of eliminate some of the most obvious suffering that is also so obviously impacting our ecosystem if everything matters. So it's it's
just a win-win-win on every front. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think I'd agree with you that everything in the ecosystem matters. I guess the distinction I make is I say, look, everything matters, but the non-sentient stuff matters instrumentally because it's so important for all the sentient beings. So in a sense, everything matters, but the sentient beings matter intrinsically, if you like. So there's a sort of special thing. So that's the way I frame it.
That's interesting. Yeah. I don't know if I guess I must agree with that in practice, right?
Yeah.
But I guess philosophically, I'm not sure as much because of just not being sure about the consciousness of all things, or the experience, just being so agnostic about that. I think also the way we talk about climate change is so stupid a lot of the times, and that we're we need to save the earth, and really what we mean is we need to make the earth continue to be hospitable for us and for the animals that are still existing on it and the plants that are still on it. But the earth, I'm pretty sure, is going to be glad to be rid of us and will regenerate and be in a,
that system will carry on and just doesn't care about anything. So
it's just, again, this kind of like weird, almost arrogance of like, we could save the earth or destroy it. It's like, no, we're really talking about our own species. Like, and I think we should be clear about that, because maybe more people would be concerned about whether their grandchildren can live or not versus, the earth, which, I think will continue on happily without us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the point you dropped in there as well, which is this idea of sort of universal compassion needs to include ourselves as well. It's quite easy to forget that when you have you can feel like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders. So,
that's one thing that that monk really taught me too, of like compassion needs to start with yourself, which sounds so selfish and like potentially dangerous as an argument, but also in practice makes a lot of sense in terms of if you don't have a good situation going on with you, the idea is that you're going to keep perpetuating harm even when you're doing, nice actions, because you're going to be like bringing this spirit of like stress and anger and whatever else behind those actions, which have all these other kinds of ripple effects. And I think we see that with activists all the time, people doing good things, but in a really stressed out or angry way. And it has all these kinds of unintended consequences. And they're also suffering so much, and that's affecting everyone they interact with in their family, in the grocery store and everything else. So, this idea of like putting on your own oxygen mask before you can help others, I think is really important for activists to see as part of their efficacy in whatever movements they're involved with and in the world, because like otherwise you're sort of diluting the power of your own positive action.
Yeah, beautifully put. And I think that brings us nicely onto the final crazily big question, which is how can we make a better future? Because in a way, I think, you and I will probably, as we've discussed, sort of different emphasis on certain things, or, different things we're more or less open-minded about. But I think roughly we share a sort of broadly naturalistic approach where we look to evidence to decide what to believe. And we certainly share a compassion for, all beings that have the capacity to suffer, everything that's sentient. And I think both of those perspectives to you and I think feel very strongly grounded and quite self-evident, robust, if you like, but nearly everybody on the planet disagrees with us, either because, they believe things without evidence, or because, there are certain large chunks of sentient beings, whether farmed or wild or even human, that they've carved out of their compassion. So in that weird situation where, maybe you and I have a high degree of confidence we've got the right answers on what's real and what matters, but almost everybody disagrees with us. How do you think about how we can make a better future? And you can think about a sort of target state, utopian vision we might be able to get to, or you can talk a little bit more about activism and your own writing and the projects you're involved in, and where you can go wherever you like on.
I think that, again, abolition of cages is a very good place to start. So, if we can move towards the premise that everyone deserves bodily autonomy, that's a real paradigm shift in terms of environmentalism, racism, sexism, because all those things are based on the idea of, okay, I should control your reproduction, right? If you're a woman, I should control your body. If we have an unjust criminal justice system that puts people of color in cages at a disproportionate amount, that is ultimately about controlling those bodies, I think. And so, dismantling those cages, and of course, the ones enslaving animals, is incredibly important, and I think would lead to a huge paradigm shift in terms of being able to, challenge that hierarchy, remove some of that cognitive dissonance, and view everything in terms of interdependence and interconnectedness more. Because if everyone deserves autonomy and safety, then I also want to make sure I'm safe around them. And how can I achieve that in society without just like putting them in a dark cage, right?
Yeah.
How can I create social structures that are going to support everyone being free and thriving?
Because that's one of the timeless challenges, because when some, particularly humans, but not necessarily just humans, use their claim to freedom and their claim to bodily autonomy in ways that harm others, then you're into that classic challenge of, okay, how do we deal with those trade-offs?
I think I mean bodily autonomy grounded in non-harm. So,
yes. Yeah.
Basically that, like I don't have the right to impinge on your bodily autonomy just because I have bodily autonomy, right? Yeah. That's just what we're operating under now, is basically that idea that there are certain situations where killing is so wrong that you will be sentenced to death for it, right? Like, what is the logic behind that, right? And so, I think that that's a major place to start, and also leads to, of course, veganism and environmentalism and respecting life as of value, as equal in certain ways, even if it's different. Like living a life grounded in non-harm and love and appreciation of interdependence. I think those are the main things. I mean, I also really do think that psychedelics are important. I'm excited by the way there's more of a conversation happening again around just how remarkable the results of all these studies with mushrooms and other psychedelics are in terms of treating depression and suicidal tendencies and PTSD and end of life anxieties. I mean, just the findings are amazing, and they've been squashed for decades, basically because of,
social norms and conservatism.
And
it's
because it was so good at opening up people's minds, that there was a lot of fear of that, because it was like connected to the anti-war effort and draft dodging and stuff like that. And it was making people question, why am I fighting, right? All these things that when you do it, you start losing any desire to.
Do we want a population of creative, open-minded free thinkers, or do we want people who will largely do what they're told?
Yes. So I do think that having that research continue, having psychedelics be more widely available or able to be part of medical treatment for people, psychological treatment, could really have profound ripple effects on everything. Just because, like, when people take even one dose, they report it as like one of the top most meaningful experiences in their lives, right up there with the birth of their child or the death of a parent. And this is like universal. And they also report higher on like these scales of openness, which psychologists measure among different things, but basically all these positive traits we're talking about fall under openness, empathy, compassion, a sort of humility about what you don't know, nonviolence. I think that, if you had more people doing this, you would see a lot less people eating animals or wanting to assert their rightness over others, because it basically makes so obvious there are other ways of perceiving reality, other planes of consciousness. We have to have humility, because by simply altering like the chemicals in our brain, we're perceiving all these things we didn't before. And I don't think that it's a hallucination. It's that literally, certain areas of the brain are quieted and others are lit up more, so that we're like perceiving through a lens of empathetic response more, in a more sensory way, the way many animals do, where like, visual and sonic things are heightened. So there's sort of humility when you come out of that, of like, oh, that's always happening. Like, trees are always alive and breathing, but because I'm filtering out that, in my normal consciousness, in order to just be able to function, I can't be perceiving the aliveness, the vibrance of all these plants, of all these living beings at all times. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist at all times, right? So yeah, I think there's just a real humility and respect for the environment that would come out of more people having that experience.
Yeah, thank you. And one thing that is a theme that runs through this sort of linking of naturalism and ethics is that I get this sense that, of course, there's a lot of, you can see there's value in the social norms that have been built up, the traditions and the cultures and ways of thinking. But if, as an intellectual exercise, you could just put all of that stuff to one side and just think through from first principles the things we do and the things we don't do, purely based on the harms they cause to others, it is like taking the blinkers off. I mean, veganism, the agenda veganism is one of those for me. I think when you look at it with clear eyes, it's just so obvious. It's sort of shocking how long it took me to get there and why most of the other people on the planet can still disagree. But there are so many topics like that where, again, you put the social norms to one side, frankly, the indoctrination that all of us go through, soft or hard, and just think it through again, cleanly, creatively. I think there are many of the bad things we do that you would just look at and say, stop that now. But there's also quite a lot of good things that we haven't done because we've been held back by those social norms. And whether, like you say, it's, chemical adjustments to our own ways of thinking and perception, whether it's social norms that have held us back into traditional roles that you talked about before as stars of relationships. I think, we drop a lot of the bad stuff and we can open ourselves up to a lot of the good stuff. And I guess this is the timeless challenge of, we're all encased in these social norms by default because, that's how families and societies work. But so much of the baggage that comes along gets in the way. And that also is, I think, the central challenge for how we make the world a better place. Because in a sense, it's not really about a technical argument or innovation or, winning a philosophical battle. In many of the cases, the answers are really obvious and they're win-win-wins on almost every dimension. The challenge is those social norms. And that's what makes social change of all types in human and non-human topics, painfully slow when you're trying to drive it. But I don't know how that leaves you feeling about, how much change we can drive, how long it will take, whether it will be quick enough. Do you generally feel optimistic about where we're going, or do you have a sort of, does it depend on the day whether you have a darker
Yeah,
tone?
I think it depends on the day. I mean, I feel a hope on an individual level. I guess like I've seen change in myself happen. I've seen myself affect change in others. So I still feel like what I do matters on an interpersonal level, and that has all kinds of ripple effects that I might never know about or live to see.
Yeah. I like the ripples idea. You don't necessarily get to see where they go, but they do go out. Yeah.
Definitely. And I don't know, in terms of, do I think like humanity will figure it out in time? I often feel more cynical about that lately, just that we're not going to be able to catch up fast enough to our own greed, like finding solutions for the speed at which we've been able to create structures around our greed or desire to consume. But we've been pretty resilient, so who knows?
Yeah.
And maybe if not, I guess there's an optimism that potentially something better could come after whatever happens with us. So yeah, I mean, I think I don't tend towards nihilism, where I have to be careful is more going more towards like hedonism and just being like, well, nothing, ultimately that I do totally matters. And maybe I don't really believe that anything happens to me beyond becoming, a part of trees and dirt after I die. Then should maybe the point of life just to be to enjoy it as much as possible. And why am I stressing out about all this stuff? And is it kind of a mistake to not just live somewhere where I can work as little as possible and am kind of under the constraints of these systems as little as possible, and just kind of like be on the beach every day and do drugs and have sex and just like enjoy myself, And I think that I definitely think there'll be times in my life where I kind of explore that way of being. But what I tend to come back to so far is like, there can be a little bit of that, but there's not enough meaning without trying to serve some greater good. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to probably exist within certain social structures and work and do all of that and try to do my bit to improve things.
Yeah, the eternal balance. So. Well, thank you. I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating to hear your story and share your perspectives and work some of these things out together.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I love that idea about extending that compassion broadly, but not forgetting ourselves, and that includes needing a bit of hedonism here and there as well. So,
yeah.
So what's the best way of people following you, buying your new book, learning more about your work, reading the things you've done? What's the best? I can include links in the show notes, of course, but where would you point people?
Yeah, thanks. My Twitter at Rachel Krantz is just my name. Same thing with Instagram. And I post most of the stuff I do, most updates is on there. There's also my website, racheljkrantz.com. I'll post some things on there. But yeah, the best thing would be to order my book, Open and Uncensored Memoir of Love, Liberation, and Non-Monogamy. And even if you think like you're not totally interested in that as a topic, but you're interested in some of the conversation we've been having today, those themes are very much still in the book and something that I will always be raising in interviews. So, perhaps some of the audience will just find value in supporting that and supporting me having a platform to talk about veganism and respect for all living beings. So that's probably the best way to support me is to order the book.
Sounds great. And I've seen some glowing reviews already. So
thank you.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thanks
well,
so
much. Thank you again so much. It's been a real pleasure, and it's great to have you join our Sentientism Facebook group today as well. So
yes.
it's a lovely community of. I mean, it's open to anyone, so not just Sentientists. There are loads of people in there who disagree with it. But it's a fascinating sort of mix of interested lay people like me, academics, philosophers, activists, writers, people from all different walks of life. So it's a so far generally a very positive social media experience. We all need a few of those. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, take care, and thank you again so much, Rachel.
You too. Thanks. It was a pleasure.